The God concept that we know, came out of the conference in Nicaea in Europe, 325 AD, 325 AD, 325 AD. The spiritual force in the world that man would later call God, that man would later call God, that man would later call God. The African saw himself in relationship to nature as he saw nature and God as one and the same. And we must remember that for most of the existence of man, the word God was not used. And yet man had a great spirituality and a great affinity for the concept that man would later call God. Africa recognized that there was a spiritual force in the universe. He knew he could not make the rain, change the seasons. He could not make a hurricane, and he could not stop one. So he recognized that this force in the world was in charge, was a force bigger than himself. And he tried to bring man in harmony with nature, as against Western man, who often tries to defy nature. But he did not use the word God, and yet he recognized the spiritual force in the world that man would later call God. The God concept that we know came out of the conference in Nicaea in Europe, 325 AD. But the spiritual concept was always there, recognized by the African, who thought that the spiritual force that ruled the universe was in everything that lives. Therefore, the African would meditate sometime before cutting down a tree, because a tree was a part of life. He'd only cut down what he needed. And he thought that the spiritual force of the universe was in the water, so he could stand by the water and meditate or pray, or in a tree, and he could stand by the tree, or in himself, so he could meditate within himself. And so he did not need a church as such, and he did not need someone to intervene between himself and the spiritual force of the universe, because he thought that he was a part of that totality and he could communicate directly. The God concept that we know, came out of the conference in Nicaea in Europe, 325 AD, 325 AD, 325 AD. The spiritual force in the world that man would later call God, that man would later call God, that man would later call God.